Could you tell me, Richard, what your experiences were that stick out in your mind when your wife was pregnant and you were attending antenatal appointments, and what happened during the delivery, the delivery in the hospital?
And I hadn't really considered other people's reactions or sort of thought processes towards, me as a person with a disability having a child. And it wasn't really until we went for that first scan appointment that I think was around the 12-week stage. And you got this overriding feeling that when we went into the sort of waiting room before the scan, because I'd used the wheelchair to get around the hospital purely because of its size and the length of the corridors, it was easier to use the wheelchair for the sort of mobility purposes. It was that overriding feeling that as soon as that door opened, you got the sense that everybody in that room was curious, they were fascinated, and you could feel 10, 11, 12, however many sets of eyes focused purely on you as that person in a wheelchair in the sort of waiting room for the scans and the antenatal appointments. It was almost as if by looking at their facial reactions and their body language, you were almost waiting for somebody to say, "Oh, have you taken a wrong turn? I think you need to be in a different department. Are you lost? Are you sure you should be here?" And it was really sort of quite a powerful thing, because you really did feel that everybody in that room was amazed that, was the person that was, with you and pregnant, was that your child? Were you just there as a friend, a guest, or, what was your purpose as that person with a very visible and very obvious disability, because you're in a bright green wheelchair? You kind of did feel that it was as if for them, the puzzles didn't, the pieces of the puzzle didn't quite fit, and that you must be in the wrong place. And it was probably the first time in many years, actually, that I really became conscious of people looking and being curious and almost staring at you because of the disability.
You were saying something earlier about issues like accessibility. You mentioned, but the first thing you mentioned was parking at the hospital, and the second one was the delivery suite. Could you just tell me about both of those times, please?
Yeah, so when we arrived at the hospital, outside the sort of delivery suite, there were only two yellow, disabled parking spaces, which I'd clocked for several weeks, but every time we'd gone to the hospital, as we got closer and closer to the delivery and sort of due date, I'd be clocking what's the best way of getting there, which turn do I need to take, and actually where am I likely to park, because I'm going to need to get the chair out. Obviously, my wife will be in labour because we're outside the labour ward. So I need to think about the quickest way, the safest way, where am I going to park? And I always have this sort of overwhelming, what if I get there and there isn't a disabled space free? So I think I kind of decided that I was just going to abandon the car. As long as it wasn't, blocking an ambulance bay or something like that, it didn't really matter where it was. So I sort of had to, make peace with myself in terms of, as long as you get there safely and you get as close as you can, it doesn't really matter which one of these two spaces you're in. When we arrived at the hospital, I sort of lost the ability to put the wheelchair together. You have to sort of get it out of the car, put the wheels on, sort of get it ready to be used. Now, this is something I've done, tens of thousands of times, but on that occasion, I don't know, I just could not do it. It became a really complicated thing. I was getting a bit sort of flustered. And it was just at that point, I was sort of in my mind thinking, what I can really do with now is a friendly pedestrian or a friendly passerby to sort of say, can I help you? Is there anything I could do? Luckily, at that point, of all people, we actually ran into the consultant that we'd seen for various scans and appointments on her way into work. So she was great. She was able to sort of identify, okay, yeah, this is what's happening, and actually was able to then put the chair together, help me lock the car, get all the bags out and get us into the hospital. But what sort of struck me as we went into the sort of delivery suite, and it was quite obvious we were staying, because I kept sort of saying to the consultant, "Oh, do you think we'll be sent back home?" And I remember quite clearly she just sort of smiled and said, no, she's definitely far enough along. It will be happening fairly soon. I thought, okay. But it was interesting because the whole process is not designed, or doesn't appear to be designed, for somebody in a wheelchair or with a physical disability, because they'd open the door to the sort of delivery room, and then you'd sort of hear, we're going to have to we'll just wait there a minute, just wait in the doorway, while there was this entire conversation about moving furniture, moving tables out of the way, making space for me, making space for the wheelchair. Did I want to stay in the wheelchair? Would I be sitting in a seat? Just wait a minute while we rearrange the room. Because in the same way that when you arrive in the sort of antenatal clinics and the appointments, people don't seem to think that somebody with a wheelchair could possibly ever need this facility, it became apparent that actually the rooms and the access side of the hospital also didn't seem to be geared up for it. It was possible for them to move things and make it accessible, but in its sort of standard format, it was as if this situation had never occurred to anybody, that this might occur.
What sort of responses have you had as a father when you've been taking George out since his birth?
I think you get a mixture. I'd say that there's probably three reactions. One is that they don't react at all. They don't see anything unusual. They just sort of accept it. The other one is a look of complete panic, almost, of oh my God, that man on the mobility scooter or that man in the wheelchair, oh my God, he's in charge of a child. You can almost sort of see them thinking, well, where's the responsible adult? That can't be safe. Surely that's not recommended. And then I think you sort of get the people that aren't bothered, don't notice, and just carry on with their day-to-day life or whatever they're doing. The people who look concerned and almost frightened that in some way you're not capable of taking care of a child, or you shouldn't be out with a child on your own. Or there's the others that are just fascinated and don't necessarily say anything, or their body language doesn't change, but they'll just sort of stand there open-mouthed, as if it's some kind of amazing, 7 wonders of the world type thing that they've seen for the first time. It's quite interesting.
It's all the sort of stuff that people maybe never actually realise when they don't have issues like you do.
Mm.
That we take for granted so much, that something that steps outside of a normal experience and a normal expectation is suddenly a big sort of gasp shock.
I mean, I think if you think of the brain as a sort of pattern-making machine, so things that we're expecting to see and things that, as far as we're concerned, that are normal, wouldn't make us sort of look again, or wouldn't make us sort of take a step back or raise an eyebrow, for example. Now, when George was quite a bit younger, I used to have we still have a baby carrier that you can obviously strap to your chest. So we would put him in that, strap him to my chest, and then I'd sit on the mobility scooter or whatever I was doing. It was quite a good way when he was younger to get him to go to sleep. I could go for an hour or an hour and a half or whatever, on the scooter. We'd go for a wander around, go around the nature reserve or whatever we did. And it was interesting because you could see that really did confuse people, because in that scenario, there's somebody on a mobility scooter, which wouldn't necessarily make them look, but it might do. But then when you could see them sort of going, oh, there's a man on a mobility scooter. But as you went past them and they realised what this thing was that was strapped to you, and actually there's a baby in there, that was you could really sort of sense that wasn't something they were expecting or just hadn't seen before. I've yet to pass anybody else on a mobility scooter with a baby carrier and a child asleep. I kind of want to see somebody else do it. But that really was something that really did it got people talking sometimes. So if we were in a queue for a shop, they'd sort of ask, how old is he? Or, normal sort of questions, if you like. But you could see some quite humorous sort of reactions to people sort of going, oh, not only was there a man with a disability on a scooter, but actually he had a child strapped to him as well. And then you did have the concerned busybody, as I like it. There was one particular woman who explained to me that I shouldn't be doing that. It was very unsafe. It went against the highway code, apparently, and my insurance for the mobility scooter because I wouldn't be insured for doing that. To which there were two responses. One was that George decided to burst out laughing, which I thought if he's going to laugh or blow a raspberry at anybody, that was a great time. But also, I just politely sort of inquired and said, well, what's the difference? If I had him in a pram and we were at a pedestrian crossing, when we go to cross the road, I'm pushing him out in front of the car before me because I'm at the back of the pram. So what's the difference? But actually, I remember quite clearly there was a police lady sort of in the shopping precinct at the time. So I went and asked her in front of this woman and said, oh, this woman's very concerned with other people's business. Maybe you need to give her some reassurance. I said, what's your take on it? And she said, well, there's nothing wrong with what you've done. He's perfectly safe. He's fast asleep. Actually, he nodded off at this point. So he's obviously not concerned. He's not in any discomfort. You clearly, are quite happy with it. I said, so the only person actually that's got a problem is this interfering person who, was quite vocal and quite aggressive in her disgust at what I'd done.
It's interesting because you've brought up something else, and that was by asking the police officer, have you ever had a response from people that might suggest, because you're disabled, because you're in a wheelchair, that you might be an unsuitable or an unsafe parent?
Yeah, not many. One or two that sort of, is that safe? Is that? But interestingly, it never came from anybody we knew. I don't think they'd have dared sort of make any comments or suggestions. It was usually, I remember there was an occasion where, we were just, George was in the hospital, maybe 5 or 6 months old, I think. He just had his surgery for his cleft, which is probably an entirely separate blog that we could actually do. But he just had his cleft surgery. And I went to pick him up out of the cot that he was in because he was crying and obviously wanted some attention. Now, I did this in exactly the same way I do at home, which is, if you imagine when you go to pick up a bag of shopping, so you sort of pick it up like this, that's what I would do. So I would get hold of, like, just under his collar of whatever clothes he was wearing, and with one hand sort of pick him up so he was off the ground, and then put another hand underneath. So it probably does, or did, look a bit sort of clumsy and a bit sort of, risky. But the thing with that is that the nurses that had been to see us several times leading up to the surgery, they'd done home visits to tell us what was going to happen and so on, knew us quite well. So actually they were quite familiar with it. I think sometimes they found it quite funny because George had a habit of laughing every time we did it because he always thought it was funny because he'd sort of spin in the air almost. But there was a new nurse who wasn't familiar with the circumstances, wasn't familiar with us, and she came rushing over and was, you shouldn't be doing that. He's not going to be very happy. He's crying. I said, he was crying before. I said, it's not that that's made him cry. Well, I don't think it's safe. To which my only response was, I don't remember anybody asking for your opinion. Because again, why do you feel that because you're in the uniform and you're the professional, as it were, why do you feel that you know what's best? My sort of thought process always was, and Michelle always said the same sort of thing. She said, I know that before you do it, every time, she said, in your mind, you're carrying out a sort of, not a risk assessment, but you're sort of going, am I stood correctly to do this? Have I got my balance? Is everything I need in place to do this sort of maneuver? She said, you're not going to drop him because, it's not a bag of shopping as an example, or something that if you drop it, it'd be a bit of an inconvenience, but it doesn't really matter. So the care and attention that you're putting into that because it's your child, so you can see, if you watch as you do that, so you can see that you're sort of evaluating it, working it out and going, okay, so I'll get to this point, then I'll lift him here and then I can put him, on the change mat or whatever it is. But from the outside, all people would see is this very unconventional way in their mind of picking up a child. And you could see concern for people. But I think I just generally chose to ignore them and learn how to do things. And that's the thing, there were some things that I couldn't do, physically I couldn't do, or I would struggle to do. So sort of getting down on the floor to change him was difficult. So I'd have to use a changing mat. I struggled to hold the bottle to do the feeding and get the right angle because of the dexterity in my hands. So I either had to learn how to do things slightly differently, or just accept that in those initial first few weeks or months, there were some things that I wouldn't be able to do. But as he grew and he was able to do more for himself and he became more mobile and more independent, I would have then be doing a lot more with him as the time went on.
Presumably clear from birth that you were going to have certain limitations. Is that right?
There were, sort of thoughts and processes that as I developed, there might be, difficulty with mobility, which certainly by the time I was about sort of 6 to 8 months old was quite clear that that was going to be the case.
So let's just have a look at that. At some point, were your parents ever told or ever given a list of things that you'd be unlikely to achieve yourself?
I think so, and I think that's where their mindset, and probably mine actually, comes from. Is that, if people said, oh, he won't be able to do this, he won't be able to do that, the more somebody told them that, he probably won't be able to walk independently, he probably won't be able to live an independent life, or whatever it is, the more somebody said to them that actually he won't be able to do that, the more they sort of pushed for that to become something that I could do, whether it was by looking at different ways of doing it. So whether my dad, he was a bit of a Heath Robinson type engineer. So if something needed to be built, he'd go and get an old bit of copper pipe out of the garage and a toolkit and try and build something that would make my life easier, or something that would solve a problem. He still does it now, actually. And I'm nearly 40. But, if there wasn't a solution available, so if the technology, because you've got to remember, this is sort of 35, 36 years ago when I was a young toddler and so on. The technology wasn't there, so things like mobility scooters weren't really a thing. The wheelchairs were a bit clunky and heavy and so on. But I think the more somebody said to them, well, you may find he has limitations with this, he can't do it, the more they would sort of strive to say, well, actually, no, we're going to prove you wrong and we're going to find a way to do it. And I think that's where my mentality comes from. My mentality isn't, and always has been, not to think of, oh, well, you can't do that. It's been more, this is something I want to achieve. Now let's go back and figure out how we do it. And if, through that process I work out that it really isn't possible, then okay. But actually, rather than my default position being you can't do it, let's think about what it is you want to achieve, and then try and think of all the different solutions or different ways that you might be able to do that.
So going from your starting point and moving through your life, you suddenly find that you're in the delivery room, little George has just appeared into the world. Explain how that was for you as an experience.
So sheer panic, I think, is the first thing. You have the sort of joy and the emotion of the child being born. The next thing, that, because I'm quite a practical person, how are we going to do this? How is everything going to be organised? The next thing that hit me, I think, quite quickly was you're now responsible for an actual person. It's no longer a baby that's on the way, and to a certain extent, I haven't got much to do in the next sort of 9 months. It was, he's here. You've now got to still be the husband. You've still got to do the work and everything else. You've got to provide a roof. But actually, there's now a person, a small person, that is reliant on you. And that, it took me quite a while, a few days probably, for that to sink in, and then to sort of switch into a default mode of, so this is my routine now. This is what's actually going to happen. Because I think you don't initially understand what's going to happen. And again, we didn't know, because we've not had a child before. George is our first child, so we didn't know what I would and wouldn't be able to do. We knew that there would be some things I would struggle with, whether that was changing him, bathing him, whatever it was. We really didn't know. And I think, my wife and I took the approach of, we don't know, but we'll figure it out when we have to figure it out. Instead of going, oh, well, there might be lots you can't do, so let's not have a child. We kind of went, well, we don't really know until we're in that situation, but we're good at solving problems, so we'll find a way.
You sound like a fantastic match, actually.
Probably, yeah. I think I'm I mean, she's very organised. I'm not so much, but I like a problem to sit down and think it through. But you just have to find a way of doing it. You know, as a parent who has a disability, you are going to come across different challenges and different situations that probably no other parent has ever experienced or would even think would happen. But you just have to have a bit of a sense of humour about it, because that's life. We're not going to wake up tomorrow when my disability's gone, or we're going to wake up tomorrow and George is not needing us for anything. So that's life. So deal with it. And actually, sometimes, by dealing with it, it just provides a bit of light relief and sometimes a bit of entertainment in terms of, well, how on earth are you going to solve that problem?
Brilliant. That's Richard. Thank you so much. If you got just briefly something to say to anybody else, whether it's an individual or a family member of somebody who also has cerebral palsy, and they're looking into parenthood, what are you going to say to them? Leave them a message and let them know how you feel about it, your opinions.
I think the first thing to do is just take it as an experience. Don't worry about how am I going to do it. Am I going to be capable? There's some great technology and great solutions out there that can help. And actually, it's all just part of the process. So just go along with it. It'll be fine. If you do end up in an antenatal clinic or something where people are staring at you and there's an awkward atmosphere, the way I dealt with it actually was to sort of switch it around and think, well, it's not my awkwardness. I don't feel awkward. It's you that feels awkward as the person that's staring, or you that feels uncomfortable. So actually, that's something that they need to reflect on and deal with. It's not something that I need to change about me or the circumstances. They need to think about how they've reacted to that situation rather than me sort of worrying about it and staying awake all night.
Again, thank you so much for giving us your point of view, your insights, and the fantastic story that you've told me today.